The discrepancy registered in my mind immediately because my brain operates entirely on structural logic. It is rigidly wired to find the fatal flaw in a foundation long before the house collapses. The early morning coastal fog still clung to the damp pavement of our quiet California street, muting the sound of distant highway traffic into a low, steady, isolating hum. As I knelt on the wet grass, the cold moisture instantly seeped through the heavy denim of my work jeans, chilling my knees. I ran the rough pad of my thumb over the scratched metal of the surveyor's pin. The solid brass was deeply gouged. Someone had intentionally struck the marker with a heavy, blunt object. Judging by the specific width and depth of the jagged striation marks, the tool was likely a 3-pound sledgehammer. The objective was obvious and deliberate: force the official property boundary further eastward, toward my new neighbor's yard. As I shifted my weight to inspect the stability of the surrounding soil, my fingers brushed against something cold hidden deep in the wet, overgrown blades of Bermuda grass near the concrete curb. Digging my fingers into the cold dirt, I pulled the object free. It was a heavy steel keyring holding 3 distinct brass keys and a small, cracked plastic fob. The unique biting on the largest key immediately registered in my mind. It belonged to a commercial-grade Medeco deadbolt. Specifically, it matched the heavy-duty reinforced deadbolt attached to the large storage shed sitting exactly on the disputed property line between my house and the new owner's lot. As I wiped the condensation and wet soil from the metal using the hem of my gray t-shirt, the sharp, jagged edges of the key cuts pressed firmly into my palm. The violent disruption of the boundary marker wasn't a clumsy accident, and these keys hadn't just slipped out of a careless pocket. A quiet, rigid tension settled in the back of my neck. The physical sensation mirrored the absolute, tunnel vision focus that takes over when a structural load calculation comes back dangerously unstable. When I stood up, the damp fabric of my shirt stuck to my skin in the morning chill. I turned toward the dark blue siding of the house next door. The concrete steps leading up to her porch were solid, correctly flashed, with absolutely no signs of dry rot or foundational shift. I knocked twice on the white trim of the doorframe. The sound cracked flat and sharp in the heavy morning air. I waited, listening to the muffled sounds of hurried footsteps approaching from inside the house. The door opened. Vienna stood there in a maroon tank top, the thin cotton fabric a stark contrast against the deep blue of the house's exterior siding. Exhaustion radiated from every line of her posture. A smudge of dark potting soil trailed across her left collarbone, and her brown hair was loose, slightly tangled from sleep or perhaps hours of nervous pacing through her empty hallways. Her dark eyes, usually sharp and observant, carried a heavy, dull weight this morning. She was 36, 7 years older than me, and usually radiated the grounded, undeniable authority of a woman who built commercial landscapes from the dirt up. Today, her shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. She just looked like she was holding up a collapsing roof with bare hands. As I kept my distance so I wouldn't crowd the threshold, I held out my hand. The keys dangled quietly from my index finger, the metal clinking softly in the quiet air. "You dropped these by the property line," I said, keeping my voice low, intensely conscious of how sound traveled across the quiet residential street. "Near the datum pin?" "The pin has been moved, by the way." Vienna didn't reach for them immediately. As she leaned her right shoulder against the doorframe, she let the solid wood take some of her weight. Her dark eyes dropped to the metal ring in my hand, then slowly rose to meet mine. The tension in her jaw didn't relax, but the frantic, scattered energy in her posture settled slightly just by looking at the keys in my possession. She studied my face for a long, silent second, her expression unreadable but intensely present. "Keep them," Vienna said, her voice a soft, raspy anchor in the quiet morning. "You'll need them again." My hand remained elevated. My grip on the keyring stayed loose but steady. "I don't own the shed, Vienna. You do. Sterling changed the padlock on the external gate last night," she said. As she spoke, she rubbed her temple with 2 fingers, a gesture I recognized as her primary physical tell for an impending migraine. He taped a formal letter of injunction to the wood. "He's claiming the 10-foot setback where my landscaping equipment is stored belongs to his parcel." When she finally reached out, her warm fingers brushed the side of my knuckles. She took the metal ring. The contact was brief, a purely functional transfer of weight, but it grounded the erratic, buzzing hum of the morning into a sudden stillness. "I need to get my transit level and my soil augers out of there by Tuesday, Eli," she continued, her voice tightening with suppressed panic. "Or my business defaults on the new city park contract. I don't have the capital to absorb a municipal default penalty. And you're the only structural engineer I know who understands how to read a century-old parcel map without making it a 3-month consulting project." Slowly closing my fist, I dropped my empty hand back to my side. The usual quiet, isolating hum of a life spent entirely in blueprints and load calculations vanished, replaced entirely by the heavy, jagged edge of the situation settling into my mind. I didn't offer a sympathetic smile. Sympathy didn't move earth or change municipal laws. I had a variable to fix. The next afternoon, the coastal sun burned aggressively through the marine layer, baking the asphalt of the street until the heat radiated upward in wavy, distorted lines. Standing in Vienna's driveway, I reviewed a massive, rolled topographical printout I'd pulled from the county archives that morning. The thick paper was stiff, smelling sharply of toner and old dust. Using a red drafting pencil, I highlighted the subterranean utility lines running parallel to the curb, tracing the exact depth of the municipal storm drains line by line. Vienna was pacing near the front of her heavy-duty work truck, organizing flats of drought-resistant seedlings. Her foreperson, Romina, was carefully loading them into the bed, checking the manifest clipped to the tailgate with sharp, efficient movements. Across the invisible property line, Mr. Sterling was standing on his perfectly manicured lawn, a heavy plastic clipboard pressed firmly against his chest. Sterling was a retired compliance auditor, a man who had spent 40 years weaponizing bureaucracy and was now trying to expand his own footprint out of sheer, malicious boredom. As he marched toward the edge of the grass, his face flushed with the kind of manufactured authority that usually made younger contractors retreat in a panic. "Miss Lee," Sterling barked, not crossing the invisible line, but projecting his voice so the entire street could hear every syllable. "I expect that temporary structure removed by the end of the week." My lawyer's notice was crystal clear. "You are trespassing on my deeded square footage, and your commercial vehicles are violating the residential noise ordinance." Vienna stopped moving entirely. As she gripped the edge of a black plastic planting tray, her knuckles turned bone white against the dark material. The social pressure of the neighborhood was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She was the new business owner. She was the one everyone was watching from behind drawn blinds. Folding the topographical map with exact, sharp creases, I placed it flat on the hood of my truck. Walking slowly across the hot concrete of the driveway, I stepped perfectly between Vienna and the property line. I didn't puff out my chest. I didn't cross my arms in a show of dominance. I simply stood my ground, my hands resting loosely in the pockets of my jeans, creating a solid physical and acoustic barrier between her and the threat. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my tone entirely flat, devoid of any emotional spike. "California Civil Code, Section 841 requires a 30-day written notice, served via certified mail, before any action can be taken on a shared boundary abutment. Your tape letter holds absolutely no legal weight. Furthermore, the county's 1,998 geodetic survey clearly designates this specific setback as a shared utility easement, not private square footage." Sterling blinked, his eyes darting to me. His grip on the clipboard tightened until his fingernails dug into the plastic. The original 1,950 deed clearly outlines the boundary to the edge of the oak tree, was superseded by the municipal rezoning in 1982 to accommodate the subterranean drainage culvert. I interrupted smoothly, reciting the exact data points I had spent 3 hours memorizing the night before. "If you attempt to forcibly remove her equipment, or if you touch that shed, you will be liable for commercial damages and intentional interference with a municipal contract. We will review the official plat map at the mediation hearing. Until then, do not approach this driveway, and do not speak to Miss Lee regarding this boundary." Sterling opened his mouth, found zero factual leverage to grip in my statement, and snapped his jaw shut. Spinning on his heel, he marched back to his house, his posture rigid with fury. When I turned around, I saw Vienna staring at me, the tray still suspended in her hands. A long, shaky exhale escaped her lips, her shoulders dropping a full inch. The sudden silence in the driveway was absolute. I didn't offer a triumphant smile. I didn't wait for applause. Picking up the next flat of seedlings from the ground, I walked past her and loaded it into her truck, securing the tailgate latch with a sharp click. She didn't need a hero with a cape, she needed an anchor. That evening, the first real procedural obstacle materialized in the form of historical zoning records. Vienna sat at her small, round kitchen table, surrounded by piles of faded municipal printouts, rolled blueprints, and bright yellow highlight markers. I sat across from her, my heavy workstation laptop open, tracing the load-bearing requirements for the retaining wall she needed to build to secure the slope permanently. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of old paper, damp potting soil, and cold black coffee. She was chewing rhythmically on the plastic cap of her pen, a nervous habit I had cataloged on day 2. Her frustration was a quiet, vibrating thing that filled the small room, amplified by the rhythmic ticking of the analog clock above the stove. The dark circles under her eyes were more pronounced tonight, a physical testament to the sheer weight of launching a business while fighting a territorial war. The city clerk won't grant the commercial storage permit without a finalized boundary agreement, Vienna said, dropping the pen onto the table with a loud clatter. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. Sterling knows that. He doesn't even want the land. He's just trying to run the clock out until my city contract expires on the 14th. If I can't store the materials on site, I lose the bid. It's a logistical chokehold. Looking up from my screen, I met her gaze. Then, we don't wait for the boundary agreement. We file a provisional, structural variance. I turned my laptop toward her. The high-resolution screen displayed a complex 3D CAD wireframe, a web of interlocking lines and stress indicators. I drafted the load distributions, I explained, pointing to the base of the digital model. The retaining wall you designed is structurally solid. Sterling's entire argument hinges on the idea that your wall will push dirt into his foundation. If we prove the wall's footing doesn't impact the subterranean culvert's pressure threshold, the city engineers can bypass the zoning clerk entirely and issue a temporary structural clearance. Vienna pulled the heavy laptop closer, her eyes scanning the complex geometry. She didn't ask me to explain it to her like a novice. Her professional landscape architecture background caught the logic immediately. As she traced the blue stress vectors on the screen with her index finger, her mind worked rapidly through the physics of the design. You calculated the soil shear strength based on the recent rainfall saturation, she noted, looking up at me. Surprise softening the deep exhaustion in her eyes. Yes, I said. I also adjusted the footing depth by 6 inches to account for the seismic shear zone running parallel to the street. The added depth acts as a gravity counterweight. Think of it like holding a heavy book at arm's length versus holding it tight against your chest. The cantilever design pulls the weight backward, anchoring the soil firmly into your property, not his. You don't guess at anything, do you, Eli? She asked quietly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly at the sight of undeniable math. Guessing builds collapsing walls? I replied, my voice steady. I build things that stay exactly where they are, put. She stared at the screen for another long moment, her head giving a slow, definitive nod. She didn't thank me, with a tearful speech. She didn't reach across the table for my hand. Picking up her phone, she dialed the city clerk's direct extension and navigated the automated menu with sharp, precise inputs. When the night duty clerk finally answered, she didn't hand the phone to me to handle it. Sitting up straight, she negotiated her own extension, using the exact structural terminology from my wireframes. Her voice was steady, commanding, and utterly professional. I watched her, my hands resting flat on the table. The urge to take the phone, to control the conversation and guarantee the outcome, was a heavy habit of my over-prepared nature. Swallowing the instinct, I forced my hands to stay completely still against the wood grain. I let her fight her own battle, sitting quietly as her silent backup, providing only the ammunition she needed to win. After she hung up 15 minutes later, a small, genuine smile broke through her exhaustion. Provisional variance hearing set for next Friday, she said. It was a victory measured in millimeters, but it was forward motion. The process of securing the variance required me to physically verify the municipal drain lines. The next morning, I drove down to the county records basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glare over rows of gray steel filing cabinets. The air smelled of industrial dehumidifiers and decaying binding glue. I spent 3 uninterrupted hours cross-referencing the 1,982 public works ledgers with the current GIS parcel data. My index finger traced the faded blue ink of the original surveyor's notes, scanning line after line of archaic zoning text. I found it. A hidden addendum in the zoning code. Section 14b. The easement wasn't just shared, it was structurally dependent on the exact slope where Vienna's shed currently sat. If Sterling altered the grade to claim the land, he would violate the city's hydrostatic runoff protocol, risking a massive municipal fine. As I paid the clerk $40 for the certified copies, the heavy notary seal pressed a permanent, undeniable ridge into the paper. I had the leverage. When I returned to the street that afternoon, the coastal weather had violently shifted. A sudden, aggressive squall was blowing in from the Pacific. The wind ripped through the neighborhood, carrying sheets of freezing rain that instantly turned the exposed, disturbed soil of the disputed property line into a slick, unstable mud hazard. Parking my truck, I saw Vienna out in the downpour, wearing a thin yellow rain slicker. She was desperately trying to drag heavy, waterlogged plastic tarps over her exposed flats of delicate, expensive seedlings. These were native Californian drought-resistant species. If their root systems flooded now, the entire batch would rot before Tuesday. The wind kept catching the plastic, tearing it from her grip, whipping it violently into the air. The drainage trench near the shed was overflowing, the muddy water creeping dangerously close to her stacked bags of specialized fertilizer. Shouting over the howling wind would have been useless, and asking if she needed help was a waste of breath. As I turned away from the property line, my boots hit the wet asphalt as I headed straight for the bed of my truck. Unlatching the heavy aluminum toolbox, I struck the clasp with the heel of my hand. The commercial-grade submersible sump pump sat inside, coiled with 50 feet of reinforced PVC discharge hose. Grabbing the cast-iron handle, I hauled the heavy equipment out into the downpour. The freezing rain soaked through my leather work boots instantly as I waded into the ankle-deep mud beside Vienna. Taking the flapping edge of the tarp from her hand without a single word, I pulled the heavy plastic taut over the flats using my own body weight. After I drove a steel tent stake into the mud with the heavy heel of my boot, the plastic locked down. Moving rapidly to the next corner, I secured it with a secondary stake, bypassing the need for conversation. "The trench is backing up," she yelled over the wind, her hair plastered to her cheeks, water dripping rapidly from her eyelashes. "I've got it," I stated, my voice cutting through the noise. Wading into the deepest part of the pooling water near the property line, I dropped the heavy cast-iron base of the sump pump directly into the mud. As I connected the PVC hose, I used a sharp, practiced twist of my wrist to secure the cam lock fitting. Unspooling the heavy yellow extension cord, I kept the connection points elevated and dry above the mud, eventually plugging it into the exterior GFI outlet on her porch. The pump roared to life with a deep, mechanical vibration. Within seconds, a thick, aggressive stream of muddy water was surging out of the discharge hose, safely diverted down the concrete driveway and into the municipal storm drain, far away from her vulnerable equipment. As I stood in the rain, the water level visibly dropped around my boots. The immediate crisis was averted. Vienna motioned toward the house, and we retreated under the narrow overhang of her back porch. The rain hammered the corrugated plastic roof above us, creating a deafening, relentless drumbeat. We stood side by side, watching the muddy water continue to drain into the street. The air was freezing, carrying the sharp scent of ozone, wet asphalt, and crushed eucalyptus leaves. I looked at Vienna. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. The thin yellow slicker offered absolutely zero insulation against the dropping coastal temperature. As we stood exactly 18 inches away from each other, watching her chest heave as she caught her breath, a profound stillness settled over the immediate space. It was the principle of the quiet room. The storm was deafening. The external world was a chaotic mess of water and noise, but the space exactly between us was absolutely silent. The frantic urgency in my chest vanished, replaced by a steady, grounding calm. I watched a single drop of rainwater slide down the line of her jaw, catching the gray light before falling to the wooden deck. The instinct to reach out, to pull her against me and share the heat of my body, was a physical ache in my hands. The discipline required to keep my boots planted on the wood was immense. Unzipping my heavy, waterproof canvas work jacket, I didn't ask permission. Pulling it off my shoulders, I draped the thick material directly over her. The heavy canvas swallowed her small frame, the lingering heat from my body instantly blocking the biting wind. "You're going to freeze, Eli," she said, looking up at me. Her teeth chattered slightly, but her eyes locked onto mine, wide and incredibly clear in the gray afternoon light. "I run warm," I stated, my voice steady. The cold was biting directly into my wet t-shirt, tightening my chest, but her physical comfort was a variable I could control. As I kept my hands firmly at my sides, I didn't touch her face. I didn't pull her closer. The boundary remained intact, letting the heavy canvas jacket act as the sole shield. "The pump will handle the hydrostatic pressure until the squall passes. Go inside, Vienna." Gripping the thick lapels of my jacket, she pulled it tighter around herself. She didn't argue. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of heavy, undeniable relief. The midpoint shift arrived 3 days later, brought by a certified courier in a plain white van. The weather had cleared, leaving behind a humid, heavy heat that made the asphalt smell intensely like tar. Calibrating a laser level on a tripod in my driveway, I watched Vienna walk out of her front door holding a thick manila envelope. The color had completely drained from her face. Locking the tripod's gimbal with a sharp snap, I crossed the yard. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "A formal cease and desist from the Municipal Planning Board," she said, her voice hollow, devoid of its usual strength. As she handed me the pages, her hand trembled slightly. Sterling didn't just file a boundary dispute. He bypassed the clerk and filed a geological hazard claim. He's alleging that my planned retaining wall will destabilize the foundation of his house. The city is halting all my business operations until an independent structural review is completed. The mediation hearing was moved up to tomorrow morning, Eli. I lose the contract. The thick paper felt toxic in my hands. The legal phrasing was a labyrinth designed to suffocate momentum and bleed a small business dry. As I looked at Vienna, the immense resilience she had been carrying for 8 grueling weeks was finally fracturing. Her shoulders dropped, and she covered her face with both hands, a quiet, desperate sound escaping her throat. The external noise of a passing garbage truck and the distant hum of lawnmowers faded into a sharp, sudden silence in my head. Stepping forward, I didn't offer empty, motivational promises. Reaching out, I pulled her directly into my chest. The embrace was entirely functional. As I wrapped my arms around her shoulders, my body created a solid physical barrier against the street, the legal threats, and the exhausting weight of the world. As she rested her forehead against my collarbone, her hands gripped the thick fabric of my work shirt. As I stood perfectly still, my breathing slowed, letting my own steady heart rate act as a grounding wire for her panic. I didn't trace her spine. I didn't rest my cheek against her hair. The structure remained intact, absorbing the tremor in her frame until she stopped shaking entirely. "I can't afford to lose this contract, Eli," she whispered against my shirt, the vulnerability costing her immense pride. "You aren't going to," I said, my voice vibrating in my chest, transferring the certainty directly to her. "I am an independent structural engineer, licensed in the state of California. I will conduct the review myself. By tonight." The fallout from the city's notice forced a new, intensely compressed timeline. The weekend became a blur of aggressive data compilation. Sterling thought he could win by outspending her on lawyers. I was going to bury him in physics. It was 2:45 a.m. on Sunday morning. The harsh glow of 3 high-definition monitors illuminated my home office. Empty coffee mugs littered the edge of my drafting table alongside massive stacks of municipal codes and soil density reports. I was running a complex finite element analysis on the retaining wall design, manually cross-referencing the soil reports with the 1,982 public works ledgers. The software calculated thousands of stress points, verifying the load distribution across a color-coded thermal map on the center screen. As hour 4 bled into hour 5, the numbers began to blur together into meaningless shapes. The joints in my hands ached from hours of rapid, continuous typing, and a dull, relentless throb settled directly behind my eyes. The exhaustion was a heavy physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, stiffening my lumbar spine into a rigid block of tension. Pushing my chair back, I stood up and walked over to the kitchen window to stretch. Across the dark expanse of the lawn, Vienna's house stood completely silent. There were no lights on. She was likely staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if she would have to file for business bankruptcy by Wednesday. As I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, the motivation behind my actions sharpened into absolute clarity. I wasn't doing this to solve a complex engineering puzzle. I wasn't doing this out of neighborly duty. I was doing this to protect her sanctuary. She had treated me with a quiet respect from day one, never asking me to change my rigid habits, never demanding more emotional output than I could naturally give. She had provided a steady, reliable presence next door, accepting my meticulous nature without judgment. Turning away from the window, I returned to my desk and sat back down. I picked up my pen. The numbers had to be perfect. Early the next morning, 2 heavy, bright orange Pelican cases sat on the front lawn. Inside was my firm's Leica Nova MS-60 multi-station, a piece of surveying equipment worth more than my truck. It wasn't just a laser level. It was a robotic total station capable of measuring angles and distances to a fraction of a millimeter using an internal piezoelectric motor. Setting up the heavy wooden tripod exactly over the city's primary geodetic benchmark embedded in the intersection concrete down the street, I meticulously adjusted the tribrac leveling screws. The digital bubble on the screen centered itself perfectly. The morning sun was heating the asphalt, creating a slight thermal shimmer in the air. When I tapped the screen, the system calculated the atmospheric refraction coefficient automatically. adjusting the internal compensator to ensure absolute zero drift in the laser trajectory. Mr. Sterling stepped out onto his porch, holding his morning coffee in a ceramic mug. Watching me with a tight, disapproving scowl, he finally spoke. "You're wasting your time, Martinez. My lawyer already submitted the official surveyor report from 1,995. The board has it. My calibration sequence didn't stop." Attaching the heavy data collector to the tripod leg, I answered. "A 1,995 report uses analog transit methodology," I said, my voice carrying easily across the distance. Keeping my eyes on the telescopic sight, I focused the crosshairs on a reflective prism set up on the far corner of Vienna's lot. The margin of error on that outdated equipment is plus or minus 3 inches. The equipment I am currently operating uses phase shift laser technology. My margin of error is less than 1 millimeter. Locking the horizontal tangent screw, I pressed the measure button. The machine emitted a sharp, high-pitched beep. The precise distance and elevation data populated my screen instantly in a cascade of green numbers. "I am currently calculating the exact spatial coordinates of your foundation corner, Mr. Sterling," I continued, my tone entirely clinical, devoid of anger. "When I combine this point cloud data with the soil shear strength reports I ran yesterday, I will legally certify that Vienna's retaining wall exerts exactly 0 active lateral pressure on your property. In fact, if you force her to halt construction, the exposed soil will erode during the next rain cycle, structurally compromising your own foundation footing. You are currently litigating against your own structural safety." Sterling didn't have a comeback for thermal refraction and active lateral pressure. As he stared at me for a long, silent moment, the coffee mug froze halfway to his mouth. Turning sharply, he walked back inside his house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Footsteps approached from behind. Vienna was standing on her driveway, holding 2 insulated travel mugs. Having watched the entire exchange, she walked over and silently handed me a mug. It was black coffee, exactly how I needed it. "You didn't even raise your voice," she observed softly, standing beside the heavy tripod. "Loudness doesn't change physics," I said, taking the mug. Our fingers brushed against the warm metal. As I kept my hand steady, the sudden, intense instinct to lace my fingers through hers right there on the street hit hard. Fighting the attraction remained necessary because she needed an objective engineer right now, not a distraction. The data was locked. We were ready for the hearing. That night, the physical toll of a 72-hour sprint settled deep in my joints. Sitting on her back porch, I stared at the finalized blueprints under the yellow light of the bug lamp. Vienna came outside, carrying 2 glasses of ice water. Handing me one, she sat on the top step beside me. "You haven't slept in 2 days," she observed, her voice quiet in the dark. "The datum points need to be exact," I replied, my pen hovering over a load calculation on the paper. "If I leave a margin of error, his lawyer will exploit it to delay the permit tomorrow morning." Reaching over, she placed her hand directly over mine, pinning the blueprint and my pen to the wood of the table. Her palm was warm, calloused from her work, acting as a physical grounding wire. The sudden stillness forced my attention upward. "Eli, look at me," she said gently. When I met her eyes, the ambient noise of the crickets seemed to fade entirely into the background. "You've done enough for tonight. If we lose tomorrow, we lose. But I will not let you break yourself for this." The urge to pull away, to keep working and retain control of the outcome, was entirely overridden by the quiet certainty in her gaze. A slow breath hitched in my chest, and the tight coils of muscle in my neck finally released. She was teaching me how to stop. Nodding, I set the pen down and closed the heavy leather portfolio. As we sat in the cool California night, the silence was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, steady gravity. As I kept my hands wrapped around the cold glass of water, the boundary held firm. The stakes for tomorrow required absolute clarity, but the relentless pressure in my chest remained entirely silent. The climax arrived in a windowless municipal conference room at the county clerk's office. The air conditioning hummed too loudly, and the fluorescent lights cast a sickly pallor over the heavy oak table. Sterling sat across from us, his lawyer flanked beside him, radiating a polished, unearned confidence. Vienna sat beside me, her posture straight, a notebook open in front of her. She wasn't shrinking into the uncomfortable chair. She was ready. The city mediator, a tired-looking woman in a gray suit, tapped her pen against a thick manila file. "Mr. Sterling alleges that the proposed commercial retaining wall threatens the structural integrity of his property, specifically citing potential soil destabilization." The mediator began, reading from the official form. Miss Lee, your operations are currently suspended under Ordinance 44. Do you have an independent review to counter the hazard claim? Vienna didn't look at me for permission. She simply nodded to me, yielding the floor to her expert. Opening my hard case, I extracted the bound 80-page structural impact report, sliding it precisely to the center of the table. The allegation is physically and mathematically impossible, I stated, my voice level, projecting absolute, unshakable authority. I am an independent, state-licensed structural engineer. I conducted a comprehensive subterranean geodetic survey this past weekend. The soil composition beneath Mr. Sterling's foundation is Type C, resting on a stable bedrock shelf exactly 22 feet below grade. Miss Lee's retaining wall utilizes a cantilevered design with a structural heel extending backward into her own property line, not toward his. Sterling's lawyer frowned, pulling the heavy document toward him, flipping through the dense pages of shear diagrams, point cloud topography maps, and raw math. This is highly technical, Mr. Martinez. My client maintains that the sheer weight of the concrete alone, the concrete weight acts as a stabilizing gravity load, I interrupted smoothly, anticipating the exact argument I had prepared for at 2 a.m. Opening a secondary folder, I slid a cross-section diagram across the table. The active earth pressure coefficient pushes the load distribution entirely toward the street drainage system. Furthermore, Section 14B of the 1982 Municipal Code, which your client's initial filing, conveniently omitted mandates that the utility easement must maintain a specific gradient for runoff. By demanding the removal of her equipment and the halting of the wall, your client is actively advocating for a code violation that will flood the city street. Sterling went pale. Leaning over, he whispered frantically to his lawyer. Reaching into my pocket, I placed a heavy, jagged piece of metal on the table. It was the top half of the brass datum pin from the sidewalk. It landed with a heavy, metallic clink. Additionally, the original municipal boundary marker was intentionally struck and bent eastward to manufacture this dispute, I said, letting my eyes lock directly onto Sterling. Using laser phase shift technology, triangulated from the city's primary benchmark, the true property line is certified. It is actually 2 feet further onto Mr. Sterling's current lawn. Miss Lee has been generous by not enforcing her true deeded footage. If this board sustains the injunction, we will immediately file for a forced property reclamation, requiring Mr. Sterling to tear up his driveway. As I paused, the heavy, undeniable weight of reality commanded the small room. The mediator looked at the data, traced the surveyor lines with her pen, looked at the broken pin, and finally looked at Sterling's lawyer. The lawyer was suddenly very interested in zipping up his leather briefcase and checking his watch. The hazard claim lacks engineering merit, the mediator said, stamping the file with a loud, final thud. The injunction is dismissed. Miss Lee, your commercial permits are cleared for immediate issuance. You may resume construction. As we walked out of the municipal building into the bright afternoon sunlight, the heavy, suffocating pressure of the last 8 weeks evaporated into the warm coastal breeze. Vienna stopped by the passenger door of my truck. After looking at the building, then at the certified permit in her hand, her eyes finally found mine. She didn't cheer. She didn't jump. A profound, quiet understanding passed between us. The battle was over. The boundary was legally and structurally secure. The following Wednesday, the concrete for the retaining wall was poured. The massive diesel engine of the mixing truck was loud, the ground vibrating steadily under my boots, but it was a productive, rhythmic noise. Standing by the edge of the driveway, wearing my hard hat, I watched the heavy gray slurry pour down the metal chute. The slump test was personally verified. The concrete was exactly the right viscosity, containing the precise ratio of water to cement. The rebar grid was tied to perfection. The structure was permanent. A few neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the progress. They had witnessed Sterling's bullying for weeks. Seeing the concrete flow, seeing Vienna's business anchor itself securely onto the property, a visible shift in the neighborhood dynamic occurred. The tension dissolved completely. Vienna was coordinating the delivery of her heavy equipment, directing a flatbed truck toward the newly secured staging area. Her business was finally moving forward without restriction. Commanding the space with natural authority, she was entirely in her element. After finishing signing a delivery manifest, she handed the clipboard back to the driver and walked over to me. Her face was relaxed, flushed with the heat and genuine happiness. When she turned to Romina, who was walking past with a heavy magnesium bull float to smooth the curing concrete, Vienna called out, "Romina." Vienna's voice was clear, carrying easily over the engine noise. "Make sure you run the final cure times and the hydration schedule past Eli. He's not just the engineer on this. He's my partner. She said it in front of the crew. She said it in front of the watching neighbors. A public, undeniable choice. The word partner hung in the air, heavier than the Portland cement being poured. Romina nodded with a knowing smile, tapped the handle of her trowel against the wooden formboards, and kept walking. As I looked at Vienna, the isolating void of a life spent only calculating risks was entirely gone. The absolute certainty of the woman standing in front of me replaced it. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a single, heavy brass key. It belonged to the new, reinforced deadbolt installed on the storage shed that morning. As I held it out to her, it represented more than just access. It was a permanent fixture in her daily routine, a shared logistic. Vienna took the key. Her fingers slid over mine, and this time, she didn't let go. Stepping into my space, she closed the final distance, maintained so carefully for 2 months. The kiss was not frantic, nor was it an exploration. It was the principle of the arrival. It felt like dropping a massive, unmovable anchor into bedrock. It was a seal on a contract, the heavy, grounding certainty of coming home. I didn't pull her tight against me. Standing steady, she anchored herself to me. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright, and her thumb traced the edge of my knuckles. The noise of the construction site was still there, the diesel engine still roaring. But it didn't matter. The structure was sound. The end. Closing thoughts. I learned that true stability isn't about avoiding the storms. It's about finding someone who will stand in the rain with you, holding the blueprints, ready to rebuild whatever breaks. Healthy love doesn't require grand, dramatic rescues. It requires the quiet, consistent discipline of showing up day after day, proving you are a safe place to land. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.